Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, a tense exchange in the West Bank as a Palestinian suspect rams his car into Israeli security forces. Meanwhile, Pallywood strikes again. ILTV takes a deeper look at the battle over the narrative of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And finally, enter the mind of your baby with the help of an amazing new Israeli device. Never a moment of calm in Israel today begins with a suspected terror attack in Judea and Samaria. A quiet morning at the Tapuach Junction in Judea and Samaria. The quiet broken by the sounds of crashing metal and gunfire as a Palestinian suspect slammed his car into a police vehicle parked by the side of the road. A police officer and a soldier have been lightly injured. But reportedly not finished, the suspect then exited his vehicle with a knife in his hand. Police responding with live fire, neutralizing the suspect, and taking him wounded into custody. Now, it's not yet known if the suspect has any connection to organized terror groups like Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But this latest attack follows Israel and Hamas announcing a ceasefire, coming at the end of an uptick of violence targeting Israelis in recent weeks, both from Gaza and in the West Bank, including stabbing attempts, hundreds of explosive or incendiary balloons, rockets, and border riots. Hamas officials threatening to resume violent activities as well, should Israel not meet Hamas's demands in the ceasefire agreement within 2 months. Israel, on the other hand, has also responded against Hamas's attacks, confirming strikes against around 100 military targets belonging to the Gaza-based terror group over the past 20 days. This including approximately 35 weapons manufacturing and armament targets, about 30 underground workshops and infrastructures, a number of military compounds, about 10 aerial platforms used for Hamas's anti-aircraft missile equipment and drones, a number of military naval targets, and at least 20 of Hamas's observational posts. Meanwhile, another incident is now capturing the international eye. A scuffle caught on camera between an Israeli soldier and a 65-year-old Palestinian man. But armed with photos of their own, the IDF is painting a very different picture to the prevailing narrative of the harmless old man being abused. So how is the narrative shaped, and which story is closer to the truth? Joining us to discuss is journalist and columnist for the Jerusalem Post and the Jewish News Syndicate, Ruthie Bloom. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi.
All right, now in the video spreading online of this incident, you can see at least half a dozen reporters and press people just kind of standing around. It's as if they were waiting for something to happen. And the method of this arrest has also been likened to that of George Floyd in the United States. But the IDF is saying that the suspect was instigating violence and had actually even assaulted the soldier in question multiple times before the video begins. And the IDF also shows images of soldiers giving the man water and care after the video supposedly ends. So who are we to believe in this story?
Oh, well, I say we believe the IDF. I tend to believe the IDF over the Palestinian narrative almost every time. Obviously, there are incidences of soldiers behaving badly, inappropriately, and they are punished accordingly. And they should be when they behave inappropriately. But in the current case, I would say that it is a typical case of, in this case, imitating the United States, using a very, let's say, using the George Floyd story to create a Palestinian narrative similar to that, because George Floyd is now world famous. And, right away it touches a nerve of a police brutality, soldier brutality. It's to try to juxtapose those two things.
So what am I right to be looking at all those cameras that are just kind of stationed there seemingly at the ready? Were they maybe tipped off that some incident was going to happen?
Well, that happens a lot with the foreign press, as a matter of fact, and probably with the Israeli press too. But the foreign press in particular, they're tipped off. They need a soundbite or a photo shoot that suits a left-wing narrative, for most of the media, that is. And in a case like this, obviously, they're going to film the part where the so-called victim is being abused by an Israeli soldier, rather than showing what it is that victim did beforehand and how the soldiers treated him beforehand.
All right, now Ruthie, Pallywood is a term referring to Palestinian propaganda. How do you tell what's Pallywood and what's truly an alleged Israeli abuse when you're just looking at the video?
You can't tell just when you're looking at the video. For that, there are many really serious researchers who have taken it upon themselves to analyze footage and film. The IDF also investigates itself, but you have other organizations like Palestinian Media Watch. You have others that spend a lot of time and resources looking into these things, examining footage, examining texts, because most of the time these things are false. And when they're not false, the IDF does take action against soldiers who behave inappropriately, as I said earlier.
All right, well, it seems like it's basically a case of don't believe what you see at first sight. Ruthie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron.
In other news, we saw a relatively successful start to the Israeli school year Tuesday as hundreds of thousands of students and staff in so-called green and yellow cities returned to the classrooms, physically and remotely. Schools in 23 red cities, or areas with high coronavirus infection rates, however, remained closed, mostly. The Haredi settlement of Beitar Illit on Tuesday ignored the health ministry orders to keep shut, alleging discrimination against the ultra-Orthodox in designating the city as red in the first place. In a letter to Health Minister Yuli Edelstein, Beitar Illit Mayor Meir Rubenstein demands explanation too, alleging that there are only 30 COVID-19 patients in the city for every 10,000 residents, a lower rate relatively than other cities which have not been labeled as red localities. Infection rates across the country, though, continue to spike, with over 2,300 recorded coronavirus cases in the past 24 hours. The total active number of ill now breaking 22,000, 423 in serious condition, the death toll rising to over 960. Health Minister Edelstein, for his part then, is now reportedly planning to support complete lockdowns in red areas at the coming COVID cabinet meeting this Thursday. Now, speaking of crisis, Israel's northern neighbor, Lebanon, is still waiting for the dust to settle following the tragic explosion in Beirut. Meanwhile, a new government under fresh Prime Minister Mustafa Adiv is forming, while French President Macron and Lebanese citizens pressure to advance major reforms. Joining us now to discuss what effect this is having in the region is Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zehavi, CEO and founder of the Alma Research and Education Center. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, I want to talk about the designated Prime Minister Mustafa Adiv. We know that he has served in recent years as Lebanon's ambassador to Germany, and he's considered a candidate for compromise. But will he join Hezbollah in a coalition, or will he try to maybe build a more secular, or allegedly free government?
My guess is that he will do basically the same as the two formers, trying to create as wider coalition as possible, including Hezbollah, and maybe even a coalition that will be controlled by Hezbollah.
Does he really even have much of a choice in this? Or is Hezbollah powerful enough that there's nothing he can do about it?
Of course not. Hezbollah is the most powerful political and military force in Lebanon today.
So why, when French President Macron is touching down in Beirut and he's talking about how, certain reforms must happen before sanctions or aid are imposed, how can he get around that truth about Hezbollah?
I think that President Macron is part of that. The fact that he is meeting Hezbollah parliament members. By the way, the traditional position of France was not to designate the civilian wing of Hezbollah in the European Union during the years. They blocked every try to do that during the years. So that's all part of the French policy, to try to keep open channels with all the political players in Lebanon, falsely, unfortunately, believing that this would bring a change. I would hope that now the French would understand that this policy didn't bring Lebanon to a change. And in the past 14 years, since 1701, we have only seen Hezbollah getting stronger.
So, what does this mean for the Lebanese citizens on the street who have been protesting for one reason or another, really, for months?
Well, I already wrote about it, that there is very little hope, especially following the outcome of the tribunal that investigated the Hariri assassination. There is very little hope for the Lebanese. And I think that now the French and the international community should change completely their policy, understanding that they should trace a completely new leadership in Lebanon that is not connected to the old one, like this prime minister that was just nominated, as you said, is part of the old system, is not any different from the old system. And more than that, to supervise much closely to where the civilian and humanitarian assistance is going, rather than speaking with Hezbollah and giving it and making it legitimized in the way Macron is acting, actually.
All right, Lieutenant Colonel Zahavi, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Moving on, the first official Israeli delegation to visit the United Arab Emirates is already heading home. But by all accounts, this historic exchange looks to be a sign of much, much more to come. The United States' Trump administration likewise touring the Middle East now, trying to get other Gulf and Arab leaders to follow suit. Mark your calendars for September 13th, 2020. The White House apparently planning to host authorities from Israel and the United Arab Emirates for a formal ceremony. The two nations, brought together with help from Washington, set to officially sign their normalization agreements. This, according to Palestinian reports, citing an unnamed but, quote, informed source. What's more, White House advisor Jared Kushner and United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have reportedly been pressuring Arab leaders to attend the landmark event. United States officials hoping to inspire these other nations to sign with Israel next. Kushner telling Emirati News on Tuesday that it's only logical and right that Israel will one day have normalized ties with all 22 Arab states in the region. So far, though, major players Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are still among the first to vocally hesitate. The Saudis telling Kushner that they'll wait for Israel to agree to an independent Palestinian state, and Bahrain saying that they'll wait for the Saudis. Then Iran going one step further, still calling out Israel and the UAE for this supposed betrayal.
لکن این لکه ننگ بر پیشانی کسانی که این اعدام رو امروز انجام دادن خواهد موند. اینها خیانت کردن، کار بسیار بدی کردن. آیه صهیونیست ها رو تو منطقه باز کردن. مسئله فلسطین رو با این اهمیت، غصب یک کشور، آواره کردن یک ملت، این چیز کوچکیه. این رو به بوته فراموشی سپردن.
Meanwhile, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas is calling on all Palestinian factions, including the PLO, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hamas, to attend a conference in Ramallah on Thursday. The focus of the meeting set to be on countering the American peace deal of the century, Israeli plans for extending sovereignty into the Jordan Valley and Judea and Samaria, and of course, the recent normalization between Israel and the UAE. In the meantime, for the average Israeli, the new Israel-UAE normalization boasts some incredible opportunities, one of which is direct flights to the United Arab Emirates from Tel Aviv and through Saudi airspace, no less. But while opening up the airways is a good thing overall, it puts Israeli national airliner El Al in an even tougher spot than it already was. Financially struggling since before the now ongoing coronavirus pandemic, El Al is currently trying to negotiate its future between multiple potential buyers and a government bailout. But now the struggling carrier must also compete with expanding travel routes as the Emirati Etihad Airways opens ticket sales to Israeli citizens. This means indirect but competitive and attractive flights from Tel Aviv to destinations all over the world, including in the Middle East, Asia, and Australia. And Emirates Airlines, consistently ranked among the best in the world, will likely open up to Israelis in the coming weeks as well, putting El Al in a very difficult position and poising to take a large share of the Israeli travel market. Now, this game may have been invented in North America about 400 years ago, but it's only now starting to get really big here in Israel. I'm talking about lacrosse, which is making its way to the Holy Land primarily through the slow and steady efforts of visionary American Jewish immigrants. And here now to tell us all about Israel's national participation is Sept Mahler, the captain of the Israeli senior lacrosse team. Sept, I'm so excited to talk about this. Thanks so much for coming in.
Hi, Aaron. Thanks for having us. Glad to be here.
All right, so first of all, how did you get into lacrosse?
I first started when I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13. I picked it up from my cousins who played. They were all older than me. They grew up in Baltimore, which is a hotbed of lacrosse in the States, and that's kind of my first go at it.
And so how did you manage to maybe bring it over to Israel or to get more Israelis involved?
Yeah, so I made my way to Israel first time on Taglit and my senior year of college, and then a few years later came back through and with Israel Lacrosse to kind of start this whole thing from the ground floor up, and 7 years later, here we are.
So what's maybe your favorite thing about the game in general and your favorite thing about playing it in Israel?
My favorite thing about the game is it combines all different sports: soccer, basketball, hockey, football, and it's very fun, it's aggressive, and it's just a combination of everything. And I think that's why Israelis are taking to it as well.
It fits the culture.
Yeah, and the reason why I love playing it here in Israel is because it's sunny all year round.
That's a very good reason to play pretty much most games here. So, what tournaments, what's the state of Israeli lacrosse?
We start with the youth. Dor Atid is our main mission here to grow the next generation. So we've got youth players from Beersheva up to Netanya. We've got about 1,000 boys and girls that own their own equipment and come to practices multiple times a week. And there's many people just like myself who have come over to Israel on trips and programs to give back to that community and kind of teach the next generation as well.
And then, I understand you have like a special program where professional lacrosse players come to Israel?
We have a Masa program this year, a gap year for college students, student athletes to come to Israel and kind of keep their knives sharp per se, take their classes online as universities are kind of in a whirlwind right now, and we have a unique opportunity over here.
Take advantage if you can.
Yeah.
And then, what are they doing while they're here? They're just going to be playing, or are they going to be maybe working with some of the youth programs you just
It'll be a little bit of everything. They'll train, they'll play. We'll see what the schools are doing here to see if we can get into them and do some youth development. And we'll also tour them around Israel and enjoy everything that beautiful country has to offer.
All right, well, the game sounds amazing, and good luck in the coming tournaments. Seth, thanks so much for coming to tell us all about it.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
All right, now this next story is for all of you new parents, grandparents, babysitters, and early life caregivers, because I'm sure you've all wished at one point or another for a way to actually communicate with your little angels, or monsters, depending on the time of day. Well, now there's a way, and Nittany Manson has all the details.
Little One Care, an Israeli startup, is changing the way parents take care of their infants. Using wearable AI technology, you can now interpret your child's cries as clearly as if they were speaking to you. When Evgeny Machaveriani and his wife had their first child, they were exposed to that horrible feeling of not knowing why their child is crying. Does it need a change? Maybe it's scared. It's probably just gas. Luckily though, Evgeny had the tools to take a deeper look. He was a hardware developer and electromechanical robotics engineer in the IDF, and he knows a thing or two about technology. So he got together with an army buddy, Shauli Gur-Aryeh, and figured out a way to alter missile control tech to work on babies. Basically, what they've done is create a wearable device that records your baby's cries and using smart AI technology, learns as it goes to flash a different color light for different cries. Blue means tired, green for hungry, yellow needs a diaper change, and red for danger. It will even alert the parents if it records no movement at all. But wait, there's more. The product features many more functions, including monitoring sleep and feeding schedules. But before you get too excited though, the product is not quite on the market yet. It's now in testing with hundreds of families reaching out to be part of the trials. But keep your eyes peeled because when it does become available, it'll be a must for any new parent.
And now for your daily cultural needs from Israel, he's a deputy minister, ambassador, diplomat, historian, production assistant in a film set, and if you didn't already know, he's also an accomplished fiction writer. Say hello to former ambassador Dr. Michael Oren, who's coming to us today with his brand new book of short stories titled The Night Archer. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for that warm welcome. That was wonderful.
That's my pleasure. Now, so how did you make this transition from a serious and tough world of politics and diplomacy to creative fiction writing?
Well, it's got to be backwards. I was in the creative world of fiction writing and went into the tough world of politics. And the world of creative fiction, you should know, is very tough too, because you start off. I started writing when I was 12. I used to collect all my rejections in a folder that got to be about the size of a Manhattan phone book, if you know how big the Manhattan phone book used to be. And you got to be tough. You got to be tough to stay in it and to deal with publishers and editors and particularly reviewers and critics. That's tough. So by the time you got into politics, hey, that was easy.
All right, well, so, why did you choose to focus on the genre of short stories this time around?
Well, I started off as a poet and moved into being a playwright. I wrote film scripts. You mentioned that I worked in Hollywood for a while. I was Orson Welles' assistant. I got there because I had won the PBS Young Filmmakers Contest as an 18-year-old. There we go.
Wow.
And but short story writing for me is kind of the ultimate form. And I think it's a very Jewish form also. We don't have a great sort of plastic art tradition in Jewish history. The only thing we ever created in the Bible was the golden calf, and it didn't turn out so good. And there's lots of music in the Bible, but we really don't know what it sounded like. But we do have is fiction, and overwhelmingly that fiction is short fiction. It's short stories. And the short stories are a combination of freedom and discipline, which is also very Jewish. Our concept of freedom, there's freedom, but with freedom comes law. There actually is no freedom without law in our tradition. And that's what short stories are. On one hand, you can be anything and anybody you want at any time.
And it really is like anything, because I read a couple of these stories. I skimmed through the rest. It's a couple hundred pages. I didn't get through the whole book yet. But you talk about ghosts, you talk about soldiers, you talk about visiting Auschwitz. What draws you to these places? Is it things from your daily life?
Well, that indeed. I mean, there are over 51 stories in this collection, and each one is completely different. As you said, there are ghost stories and mystery stories and God stories and yes, stories about Auschwitz and the military, because I spent a lot of time in the military here. They reflect all my experiences. I've had a varied career, as you know, and very compelling career, and I draw on all of them. Many years in the Israeli army. I'm a reserve major. I've been in a couple of wars and campaigns. That all basically gets compressed into one story, about a page and a half. A story set in a war, which those of you who know Israel's war will recognize as an Israeli conflict. And the people around the campfire are very much IDF soldiers. But with that freedom comes a lot of discipline, because you have to get an entire story into that 1.5 pages.
Yeah, I've heard from a lot of people that it's quite difficult. Yeah, I've heard that it's quite difficult to boil a story, that it's actually oftentimes easier to write a longer story.
Much easier, vastly easier to write a 300-page novel than it is to write a three-page short story. Because in those 3 pages, you've got to get the characters and development, you've got to get the plot, you've got to get the drama, and you got to keep your reader interested for those 3 pages and have them going on to the next story, which is, I hope, will happen with this book.
I think it's very successful, but don't just take my word for it. Everybody who's watching right now, go out and check out The Night Archer by Ambassador Michael Oren. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Lito. Tada. Bye.
Bye. All right, and now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight should be clear to partly cloudy and hot. Lows sitting at an average tonight of around 76 Fahrenheit or 24 degrees Celsius. And then tomorrow you can expect a slight rise in temperatures to a whopping average high of 99 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And now, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. I'm so confused. Is it massaging him? Oh, wow, those eyes. I want to say it's a thermometer, but wow. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.37 shekels to the American dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.